So welcome to this week's Trailhead Live. My name is Ian Gotts. I'm the CEO of Elements.cloud, and this week I want to talk about how you manage documentation around every phase of the Salesforce lifecycle. Now, I know none of us like having to do documentation, but I think we all realize how important it is, and therefore I want to talk about how to make sure everything you do you get the maximum impact from. So for those of you who don't know me, I've been around the Salesforce ecosystem for about 18 years. I was involved in the very first Dreamforce type event in London, where it was 120 people, 3 customers, we were one of them, and Mark. And it's come a long way since then. It's been an amazing journey. I've also written a number of books on business analysis, change in Salesforce, and I'm passionate about helping the ecosystem deliver better implementations. So first of all, let's look at the Salesforce implementation lifecycle. And you can see it here, the 4 phases of analyze, build, deliver and operate. So in the analyze phase, we're understanding what the business users need, building user stories, so we can then pass them across to the build phase, where it can be configured or coded, and we can document what we've built, get it tested. So we're then in a position to go to the grey corner to deliver, where we're backing up our metadata, deploying the changes through the implementation lifecycle, releasing it into production. And then in the green box, we're in production. We're monitoring whether people are using the apps we built, obviously backup and restore, making sure if we're in a regulated environment there's compliance. And then finally, we're collecting feedback and training end users. And that feedback will then start the cycle again, where we turn that feedback into requirements. So as we go around that entire life cycle, there's quite a lot of documentation that flows back and forth to support the implementation. So I'm not talking about the documents that you might have in the operation of Salesforce, such as contracts with customers. I'm talking about the documentation to manage the implementation life cycle. So if we look at this picture again and look at the flow of documentation in and out, and at the center we have a document database, you can see if we start in the middle there, train and feedback, we're getting feedback from our end users, we're getting optimization ideas that are coming back from end users or from admins or developers. Then in the purple phases, we're then capturing requirements, so we're taking those that feedback, turning it into requirements, we're then having to validate the requirements. So in the process mapping phase, we are mapping processes, creating ERDs, entity relationship diagrams or data models. In the impact analysis, we're obviously trying to understand what changes will have an impact on our implementation, on our org, and we're then writing user stories. So the analysis phase is really about creating content, which then gets used in the build phase. So the user stories are used to configure and code. The process maps will be used in test. But in this phase, we will be generating some documentation. We want to document why we made changes. We want to understand why we have added Apex classes, added record types, why we've added new fields. So that documentation, and it could be as simple as a short note, it could be a photograph of a whiteboard, it could be a link to a specification. It doesn't really matter, but that documentation is valuable for the next time we go around the cycle. When we're in the deliver phase, we obviously need the org analysis again to understand the implications of deployment. If we're doing any data load, we need our data model, the ERD, and maybe some org analysis to understand how to structure that data load. And then when it comes to release, we're not just releasing the app, but we're also releasing any training material, which might include some of the process maps we've drawn. In the operate phase, we're using the process maps around compliance. So as I said, in a highly regulated industry, those process maps are what the auditors would look at to prove that this is what you should be following. And hopefully that's what the end users are using, maybe embedded inside Salesforce, so they understand how to follow due process. Obviously the training side, any of the documentation about why things were done, process maps can be used as training material, but this is a phase where we are then capturing feedback, so that's going back into that database. So if we think about that as a very high-level process diagram, at the top you can see the green boxes, submit feedback, fix technical debt, where we're getting feedback or optimization ideas. On the left hand side we've got requirements coming in, which could be, I know, a statement of work, suggestions, a few random wishes. Someone says, I think we need Einstein. And those requirements we will then validate by mapping them as in terms of our processes, and we'll also start thinking about how it changes the data model, which then gives us final requirements, which means we can write user stories, perform the risk analysis, and then that goes through to configure, code and test, and there you can see the help documentation coming out. So we've looked at a high level. I then looked at what it looks like from a process perspective, particularly focusing on the sort of a little bit of operate, most of analyze, and a little bit of build. But let's now look at the different entities, if you will, the different sorts of documentation that you need, and let's look at the interrelationships. And yeah, it looks complicated. It looks like a scary wiring diagram, and what I want to do is take you through each of these different types of documentation, just so you understand the relationships between each of them. We'll start at the very top there with feedback. Feedback will be linked to Salesforce metadata items, so hopefully when someone says, I think this field needs to be changed, we've linked that feedback to the particular field, or to the object, or to the page layout. Feedback will then turn into requirements, and feedback could also turn directly into user stories. So there's a relationship between feedback and requirements, feedback and user stories, and feedback on Salesforce metadata. And again, that feedback, it's valuable to capture it and keep it rather than just having it sit in an Excel spreadsheet somewhere, because when we come around the loop again and someone says, well, why do we make those changes? You can actually point and go, well, this is the feedback we had, this is why we did it. People talk to me and go, but why do I need documentation? Because I can see what got built, and absolutely you can see what got built. But what you don't get, simply by looking at an org, is why was it architected in that way? What was the thinking behind the consultant or the admin or the developer about why they implemented the changes in a particular way? And that's the bit that's often missing, and that's what causes most of the problems when you start to try and unpick an org or try and work out why, if you're going to make a change, what the implications are, is you don't understand why things were done. And it may be you look at it and go, that's just mad. Why did he do it that way? Well, it might be because there was a very good reason, which is the functionality which now exists didn't exist when someone wanted to go and build it, so they had to go and build it. Probably someone built the equivalent of a path, and now you look at Lightning and go, but path exists. Yeah, but before Lightning it didn't. The other reason it might be unusually coded is because people didn't want to write Apex. They just wanted to do configuration, so they had some wild workarounds to make sure they didn't have to write code. A third reason is maybe they just didn't understand how Salesforce worked. We see in orgconfessions.com, we see a lot of examples of custom fields mirroring standard fields, custom objects mirroring standard objects, because people just didn't realize they existed. So feedback, really important to capture it and make sure that it's linked back to requirements, user stories, and Salesforce metadata. So the next thing is we're going to generate some requirements. A feedback isn't a requirement. A feedback might say, I don't think this works. That's not a requirement. You need to work out what the business requirements genuinely are. You want to meld those and add those to the other requirements you've already got. And requirements will be linked to user stories. Requirements will be linked to process maps, because as you start mapping the processes, that's how you validate the requirements. So you want to make sure there's a linkage there between an activity box on a process map back to a specific requirement. And obviously requirements will make changes to metadata, which is why, again, you've got a link there from sales back to the Salesforce metadata. So if we start mapping our business process maps and we get some valid requirements, we can then start to understand how we build our user stories. So there are our user stories. The user stories will be linked to maybe objects in the data model if we've been changing the data model. They will be linked to the Salesforce metadata, the specific items in your Salesforce org that are going to be changed based on that user story. And they're going to be linked to maybe steps in the process map. And with all of these things, with requirements, user stories, also process maps, there may be links to external documentation and collaboration. There may be useful links to, I know, a screenshot, a photograph of a whiteboard, a document in Google Docs. So again, with all of these, we're linking to external documentation. When I start thinking about process maps, again, a process map is going to be linked back to a requirement, as we've already seen, linked back to a user story, but also linked back to the Salesforce metadata. So when we start thinking about a particular process step, the link back to the Salesforce metadata is, to do this step, I need these things in Salesforce. I need this list view. I need this record type. I've created this custom object. Again, really valuable, because with that little purple line, you've got going in one direction. You say, if I make a change to this metadata, which processes am I going to affect? Going from the process map to the Salesforce metadata, if I change this process, which Salesforce items do I need to go and change? You can also see there's a link there from a process map to a process map. One process diagram may lead to another, either hierarchically or end to end. So again, we need to be able to link particular diagrams together to make sure that it's easy to navigate. And again, we're linking to external documentation. We may well build a data model, an ERD, and again, that will be linked back to the user story, as you already heard, but it's also linked back to the Salesforce metadata. I know that there's a schema builder inside Salesforce, but sometimes that can become a little bit scary if you've got hundreds, if not thousands of objects. Sometimes you just want to draw out a subset of the objects you're going to work on, so it's easy to understand the relationships. And you draw those out separately, but you can then link each one of those objects in your diagram back to the object inside Salesforce, so you've got a direct link, so you understand what the connections are. Which leads me back to the heart of all this, which is your Salesforce metadata. This is all of the configurations inside your org, be it 100,000 reports, 40,000 email templates, the thousands or at least hundreds of custom objects and all their fields. So everything in your org needs to be sitting in a metadata dictionary so you can make all these links. And you can see there the linkages from Salesforce back to feedback, back to user stories, back to the ERD, to process maps, and to external documentation, the documentation for why did I make those changes. And that really is the very heart of it, this metadata dictionary which connects all of these other entities: feedback, requirements, user stories, process maps, your external documentation, and your ERD. So if we look at all of these are the different types of documentation that you're storing. And three principles that you need to try and work with. First of all, this content needs to be centrally managed. It can't sit in a series of disparate folders or file structures, because you need to make sure that you can centrally manage it. You can capture all the feedback in one place. All your requirements are in one place, so you can start to manage them in a controlled way. So when we were first building Salesforce 18 years ago, maybe it was 5 users and a very simple data model. It was accounts, contacts, leads, and opportunities. And it was very tactical. Now we've got massively complex, very strategic applications, and we need to think carefully about how we manage those. We can't afford to make changes, break something, and have the entire company staring at a blank screen because the org has been broken. So it's important that we apply the rigor to all of this documentation that you would apply to managing the data inside your Salesforce implementation. The second thing is we need some way of making sure we maintain all those relationships between each of those different items of content. And some of those relationships are quite difficult to maintain when you think about how much your Salesforce metadata is changing over time. But again, it's important those relationships are maintained so that we have a complete picture of your implementation. And the last point is these need to be version controlled, because as you go through new releases of Salesforce, you need to be able to look back and see the changes that were made, because you may need to step back and go, okay, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, why did I make those changes? Okay, I now get it. Yes, I understand where we are now. So let's just have a quick look at how we may do some of these things. Maybe we're capturing feedback inside an object. Here you can see, this happens to be elements, but you can see it against the object. You can leave feedback any of the fields you could leave feedback. So we're capturing the feedback and automatically tying it back to that metadata item. We're managing those requirements centrally. So we're starting to look at a status because we're managing requirements through a life cycle. We're starting to look at the risk. We're starting to look at the priorities. We're adding more documentation to make sure we have a clear view about those requirements. When we start mapping processes, we're starting to engage the end users to say, how is it your business works? So I can really bottom out what those user requirements are. And again, here you can see the this UPN, Universal Process Notation, that has been around for about 20 years. There are a number of different videos in my set of analysis Trailhead Live videos that talk about business process mapping in more detail. But it's a very simple approach. Anybody can read it and understand it. Again, very easy for end users to use as training material. It's very useful for developers to understand the context of those user stories because they can start to see the processes. Again, I don't think data models need any explanation. There's a very clear notation about the way data models work. The linkages between particular objects or data entities, as they're called. The same is true for user stories. A user story is has a very standard format. As a ... in this case sales user, I want to add an opportunity that's not in US dollars so that I can sell to non-US customers. And this user story is the technical specification. The requirement is the business specification. The user story is the technical specification, and that's what gets passed to the development teams who either code or configure it to build the application. But they need one more bit of information. They need to understand the risk level of a particular user story. They need to know whether it's high, medium or low, because then they can start to categorize the risk level of the release and understand what is the fastest way of getting it into production. Whether you have to go through all the phases of the development life cycle if it's high risk, or whether we can take a shorter route because it's medium or low risk. So at the beginning I showed you this diagram with all the different flows in and out of this data dictionary through each of the different phases. I often get asked, well, can't I just do this with an Excel spreadsheet? Probably if you've got this far through the presentation, you're realizing that a spreadsheet probably won't hack it. But if you need more convincing, here are 10 reasons why Google Docs using a spreadsheet and various documentation is not good enough to manage this documentation when we are building strategic applications inside Salesforce. First of all, we have a number of different entity types, these different types of documentation. Second question, which orgs? Are you going to document your production org or your sandboxes? What happens when you migrate from sandbox to production? What happens with the documentation? A proper metadata dictionary, something like Elements, actually will make sure that as you document a sandbox or a production and then you migrate changes through that implementation cycle, that documentation follows it. You don't have to try and document a particular sandbox and then document it again when it gets to production. How do you keep it in sync as the orgs change? So there's the metadata API, which provides access to a lot of the metadata, not all of it. Again, you need to make sure that the metadata dictionary stays in sync with the production and sandbox orgs. And again, the metadata dictionary, the metadata API is the way to do that. Number 4, a spreadsheet, Google Docs, everyone has access to. So how do you control access rights? How do you give some people view rights, other people edit rights? You don't necessarily want the end users changing any documentation, but some of it you may want to expose to them as help material. So you need to think about access rights. We talked a little bit earlier about version control. So particularly if you're in a regulated environment where you need to show that there's versioning of the documentation. This metadata dictionary is great on its own, but it's fantastic when it's already embedded inside Jira, if you're using that for your user stories, inside Salesforce, so that you can document what you're doing inside setup or inside a record page or inside, say, Capado, if that's what you're using for your DevOps cycle. So this content needs to be surfaced inside other apps to make it more valuable. How are you going to report? How are you going to report across multiple entity types? Show me all the user stories that are associated with this requirement and are in this release. So there's some complex reporting you should be able to do if it's all controlled in one place. Number 8 is a real kicker, the really big one, org impact analysis. If you've got all this information in one place, you suddenly get a far better picture of the risk of making changes to your org. And combine that with the dependency API, you can do some fantastic impact analysis. How many admins do you talk to who make a change and then cross their fingers and go, I hope nothing breaks? That is no way to manage a strategic application. In fact, our CIO said that that is negligent if you're taking that approach. You must be able to have confidence that the changes you're making will not break the org. And in fact, we obviously use our own application elements. We put about 50 change requests through to our org, which is fairly complex with integrations to third-party apps, multiple custom objects, ton of flow. We put about 50 changes through a week. Over half of those we put straight into production because we are confident that those changes are low risk because we've done a comprehensive impact analysis. If nothing else that you get out of this is documentation will help you accelerate your implementation because you have more confidence that you're not going to break something. Number 9 is linking back to external documentation. You may well have help documents. You may have process diagrams drawn in other applications. You may have specifications in Google Drive. You've got content in Jira, in Rally, whatever you're using for your user requirements. How do you tie all that together? And finally, Salesforce is not an island. It is connected to other applications. So therefore, being able to document the metadata for other applications like Workday or ServiceNow means you get a better picture about how Salesforce is being used. So there are 10 reasons why Google Docs is probably not good enough if you want to manage the metadata, manage all of the supporting documentation in a rigorous way. Which of course is why applications like Elements and some other applications out there you'll find on the App Exchange exist. So some key takeaways. First of all, it's fundamental to managing the life cycle to get a handle on all these different types of documentation. The second takeaway is the power is in the aggregation of all this content. If you just see a user story in isolation, you have one bit of the picture, but you see the user story connected to a requirement, a process map, the metadata item, and any supporting documentation. That's the gold dust. And finally, using Google Doc or Microsoft Office is unrealistic. Absolutely, you can do that, but the cost overhead in terms of time and inaccuracy probably doesn't make it worthwhile. A couple of resources there. There's the success community, the business analyst success community. We've put some training material together at train.elements.cloud. And at any time, reach out to me at ian@elements.cloud or at Ian Gotts on Twitter. So again, thank you so much for joining me to talk about documentation. Not normally everyone's favorite activity, but hopefully I've left you inspired that you can start thinking about the documentation you need to manage your org, so it'll actually make it easier for you to control your org, so your org doesn't control you.